You probably think of a parking lot as one of the least interesting pieces of real estate in America. It is just asphalt, painted lines, a few lights, maybe a parking meter. And then for $10, $20, or sometimes much more, you leave your car there for a few hours. But here's the strange part. A parking lot doesn't have to manufacture anything. It doesn't sell you a product. It doesn't need a kitchen, a factory, or shelves full of inventory. It simply controls a small piece of land in the right location and charges people for access to it. And when that piece of land sits next to an airport, stadium, hospital, office district, downtown, or major event venue, the economics can become surprisingly powerful. In fact, the US parking lot and garage industry generated about $11.3 billion in revenue in 2022, according to Census Bureau data compiled by the Federal Reserve, Fed. So how does a business built around empty space generate billions of dollars? The answer is not really about parking. It is about land, scarcity, utilization, pricing, and cash flow. And once you understand that, the humble parking lot starts to look very different. Imagine you own a piece of land in a busy downtown neighborhood. The land is expensive. You could build an office building on it. You could construct apartments. You could put up a hotel. Or you could pave it, paint some lines, install a payment system, and start charging people to temporarily use the land. That sounds almost too simple. But simplicity is exactly what makes the economics interesting. The customer isn't really buying asphalt. They're buying access to a scarce location, and that distinction explains almost everything about the business. Think about what happens when you drive into a parking lot. You pull in, you find a space, you park, and eventually you leave. From your perspective, the transaction might last 2 hours, but the business is constantly asking a different question. How many times can I monetize this same piece of land? That's the basic money engine. A restaurant can sell one table to one group of customers for an hour or two. A hotel sells a room for a night. A parking lot can sell the same physical space over and over again throughout the day. And unlike a traditional retail business, the inventory doesn't disappear when the customer buys it. The parking space is still there. That means the core model is remarkably simple. Available spaces, X utilization, X price equals parking revenue. And this is where the first major economic insight appears. A parking lot doesn't make money simply because it has a lot of spaces. It makes money because those spaces are in demand. A 500-space parking lot in the middle of nowhere could be nearly worthless. A 50-space lot next to a packed stadium could be extremely valuable. The asset isn't really the parking space. It's the location attached to the parking space. Now, let's build a hypothetical parking business. Suppose an investor acquires a surface lot with 100 parking spaces in a busy commercial area. We're going to use simplified numbers here. These are illustrative assumptions, not a claim about what every parking lot earns. Suppose the average customer effectively pays $10 for a parking session. If each space generates just 2 paid parking sessions per day, that's 100 spaces x 2 sessions x $10. That's $2,000 per day. For 30 days, that's about $60,000 in gross parking revenue. And suddenly, the piece of asphalt doesn't look so boring. But there's a problem. Those 100 spaces cannot be sold infinitely. There are only so many hours in the day. Demand might be weak in the morning, strong at lunchtime, extremely strong during an evening event, and nearly non-existent overnight. So the real business question becomes, how do you maximize the revenue produced by each available space? That's called utilization. And sophisticated parking operators obsess over it, because raising utilization from 40% to 60% can potentially be far more powerful than simply building more spaces. You are increasing the amount of money generated from an asset you already own. And that is one of the most attractive characteristics of the business. But before the first dollar of revenue appears, someone has to pay for the land. And this is where people often misunderstand parking businesses. They see asphalt and assume asphalt is the expensive part. Usually it isn't. The biggest economic question is often, what does the land cost? Imagine you find a vacant parcel in a growing suburban area. The land might be relatively cheap, but move that same parcel into a dense downtown district, near an airport, stadium, hospital, or transportation hub, and the economics can change dramatically. Suddenly, you're competing with developers who want that same land for offices, apartments, hotels, restaurants, or retail. The parking operator is therefore making a bet. They're saying, the cash flow generated by parking this land is high enough to justify what I'm paying for the land. That is a real estate investment decision disguised as a parking business. And it leads to a fascinating distinction. There are actually several ways to own a parking business. You can own the land. You can lease the land from somebody else. You can operate somebody else's parking facility. Or you can combine ownership and professional parking management. Those models have very different economics. If you own the land, you have a potentially valuable real estate asset, but you also have enormous capital tied up in it. If you lease the land, you need much less upfront capital. But now the rent becomes one of your biggest expenses, and if you simply manage parking facilities for property owners, you may not own the asphalt at all. You're selling the service of operating the parking business. That distinction matters enormously. Let's say our hypothetical 100-space lot requires roughly 37,800 square feet. Why? Because a parking space isn't just the rectangle where the car sits. You also need drive aisles, circulation, entrances, exits, landscaping, accessible spaces, and other required areas. A commonly used planning benchmark is around 378 square feet of total lot area per parking space for a typical 90-degree configuration. My curb spot, so 100 spaces can require roughly 37,800 square feet. That's almost an acre. And now we can see something important. You aren't really selling 162 square feet of asphalt. You're monetizing a much larger piece of land. That means the value of the parking business can be extremely sensitive to the value of the underlying real estate. Then comes construction. A basic asphalt parking project can cost several dollars per square foot, depending heavily on location, drainage, grading, materials, and site conditions. Current U.S. estimates vary widely, with commercial projects commonly landing somewhere in the several dollar per square foot range before unusual site complications. Commonwealth paving, and then you add drainage, lighting, striping, curbs, landscaping, security, signage, payment equipment, cameras, permits, accessibility requirements, and potentially electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So even a business that looks like just pavement can require serious capital. And if you move from a surface lot to a parking garage, the numbers become dramatically larger. WGI's 2025 parking cost study put the national median construction cost for a new parking structure at about $31,400 per space, or approximately $93.85 per square foot. Flip HTML5. That's why surface parking and parking garages are almost two completely different businesses. A surface lot is relatively simple. A garage is a construction project, a real estate project, and a parking operation all at once. Now imagine the lot is built. The customer arrives. Where does the money come from? The obvious answer is hourly parking, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. A parking facility can have several revenue streams. Transient parking, monthly parking, event parking, reserved spaces, valet parking, airport parking, hospital parking, and sometimes additional revenue from things like advertising, commercial rentals, or other services. For example, public filings from parking real estate company BEP show a useful distinction between transient parkers and contract parkers. In 2025, the company reported $18.6 million in transient parking revenue and $9.8 million from contract parkers across its managed properties, plus ancillary revenue. SEC. Why is that distinction important? Because these customers behave differently. The transient customer might park for 2 hours and pay a premium. The contract customer might pay a monthly fee for reliable access. One produces flexibility, the other produces predictability. And a good parking business can combine the two. During the day, you might have office workers using monthly spaces. At night, those same spaces may become available to restaurant customers or event visitors. Now the owner isn't simply selling parking. They're stacking different types of demand on top of the same physical asset, and that's where the economics become much more interesting. If you're enjoying this breakdown and want to see how ordinary-looking businesses can hide surprisingly powerful economics, Subscribe to Money Behind, because sometimes the most interesting money isn't in the glamorous businesses. It's hiding in the boring ones. Now let's follow the money even further, because $60,000 a month in revenue sounds fantastic. But revenue is not profit. The parking lot has bills. If you lease the property, there's rent. There are employees. There are payment processing fees, insurance, property taxes, lighting, cleaning, snow removal in some markets, security, maintenance, paving repairs, striping, technology, marketing, equipment, and potentially debt service. The Federal Reserve's census-based data shows just how substantial the expense side of the industry can be. Parking lots and garages reported about $9.7 billion in expenses in 2022. Fred. So the industry generated roughly $11.3 billion in revenue and $9.7 billion in reported expenses that year. That doesn't mean every parking business has the same margin, and it isn't a direct measure of owner profit. But it makes one point very clear. Parking revenue is not the same thing as parking profit, and the difference can be enormous. Let's build our hypothetical lot again. Suppose it generates $60,000 per month. That's $720,000 in annual gross revenue. Now imagine the owner has $180,000 of property-related costs, $90,000 in labor and management, $50,000 in maintenance and utilities, $30,000 in insurance and technology, and another $40,000 in miscellaneous operating expenses. That's $390,000 of operating expenses. The business would have about $330,000 left before financing, taxes, depreciation, and other owner-level costs. Again, this is an illustration, but notice what happened. The business didn't need $720,000 in revenue to create $720,000 of wealth. It needed to spend money to keep the asset functioning. And if the owner borrowed money to acquire the property, the bank gets paid before the owner gets comfortable. This is where leverage enters the story. So, imagine the owner buys the property for $3 million. Instead of paying the entire amount in cash, they put down $900,000 and finance the remaining $2.1 million. Now the business controls a $3 million asset with less than $1 million of equity. That can be extremely powerful if the parking cash flow is strong, but it can also be dangerous. Because the loan payment doesn't care whether the parking lot is busy. The bank still expects its money. If a recession hits and nearby offices empty out, weekday parking demand could fall. If a new parking garage opens across the street, prices could fall. If interest rates rise and refinancing becomes expensive, the owner's cash flow can shrink. And suddenly that beautiful leverage works in reverse. This is why parking is not simply a passive income business. The asphalt might be passive. The economics aren't. Now we get to one of the most important numbers in the entire business: revenue per parking space. Parking operators increasingly track metrics built around revenue per available stall. PEP, for example, reports a metric called RevPAS, revenue per available stall, to evaluate the performance of its parking facilities. SEC. Why does this matter? Because 100 parking spaces in one location can be radically more valuable than 100 spaces somewhere else. Suppose Lot A generates $100 per space per month. That's $10,000 per month. Lot B generates $300 per space per month. That's $30,000. Same number of spaces, same basic business, completely different economics. So when a professional parking operator looks at a lot, they're not just asking how many spaces are there. They're asking how much revenue can each space generate and how consistently. That is a much more sophisticated question. And now we reach the hidden economics. The real opportunity isn't always owning the parking lot. Sometimes the opportunity is owning or controlling the system around it. Think about what happens when technology enters the picture. Instead of having an employee sit in a booth collecting cash, a parking operator can use license plate recognition, mobile payments, automated gates, digital reservations, cameras, dynamic pricing, and centralized management. The customer drives in. The system recognizes the vehicle. The customer parks. The payment happens digitally. The customer leaves. The transaction can happen with almost no human interaction. That can reduce friction. And if the technology lowers operating costs while making pricing more flexible, the operator can potentially increase the amount of money generated from the same physical space. That's why parking has attracted technology companies. One striking example is Metropolis. When Metropolis acquired SP+, the transaction was valued at about $1.5 billion, with Metropolis later announcing the completion of the deal in 2024 and describing a network of more than 4,000 locations and more than 20,000 employees. Metropolis, think about what that tells you. Billions of dollars of enterprise value can sit around something that most people think of as where I leave my car. That's the difference between looking at a business from the customer's perspective and looking at it from the investor's perspective. The customer sees a parking space. The operator sees a network of locations, contracts, transactions, pricing data, technology, and recurring cash flow. And there's another hidden business model. You don't necessarily have to own the parking facility. You can manage it for someone else. This is especially important for airports, hospitals, universities, hotels, municipalities, and commercial real estate owners. The property owner may own the garage. A specialized parking company operates it. The operator handles technology, employees, enforcement, customer service, maintenance coordination, pricing, and revenue optimization. The owner gets parking revenue. The operator gets paid for managing the operation. This creates an asset-light model, and asset-light businesses can scale differently from real estate owners. A property owner has to keep buying land. A management company can potentially win contracts and operate more locations without purchasing every underlying property. That is one reason parking has evolved beyond simple land ownership. It's becoming a combination of real estate plus operations, plus payments, plus technology. Now let's talk about break-even. Suppose our hypothetical parking lot has fixed operating costs of $30,000 per month. And after variable costs, the business effectively keeps $8 from each paid parking transaction. The lot would need $30,000 divided by $8. That's 3,750 transactions per month just to cover those fixed costs, or about 125 transactions per day. If the lot has 100 spaces, that's an average of roughly 1.25 paid transactions per space per day. That is the number that matters, not the giant annual revenue number, not how busy the lot looks from the street. The question is, how many monetized uses does each space need to generate before the economics work? And suddenly, parking becomes a utilization problem. Now imagine 3 years. In the bad year, a major employer nearby closes. Demand falls 30%, revenue falls, but the land payment doesn't disappear, insurance doesn't disappear, property taxes don't disappear, debt doesn't disappear. The owner gets squeezed. In a normal year, the lot maintains steady demand. The owner raises prices modestly, controls costs, and generates predictable cash flow. In a great year, the neighborhood gets a new stadium, hotel, office complex, or transit connection. Demand explodes. Now the same 100 spaces can generate dramatically more revenue. The owner hasn't necessarily built anything new. The asset simply became more valuable because the surrounding environment changed. And this reveals one of the strangest characteristics of parking. The parking business can benefit from economic activity that it didn't create. A new office tower brings workers, a hospital expansion brings patients, a stadium brings fans, a restaurant district brings customers, an airport brings travelers, and the parking lot monetizes the movement of all those people. The parking business is effectively sitting downstream from other people's economic activity. But there's a major risk hiding underneath that strategy. Land is scarce. That sounds great if you own it, but it can also be terrible if someone else finds a more valuable use for it. Suppose your parking lot produces $300,000 of annual operating cash flow. Then a developer approaches the owner and says, "We want to build apartments here." The land might be worth much more as development land than as a parking lot. That's good for the landowner if they can sell, but it creates a problem for a parking operator leasing the property. The landlord may eventually decide that parking isn't the highest and best use. And that means the parking business can depend on something it doesn't control, the future value of the land. This is one of the biggest differences between owning the dirt and merely operating on it. And then there's competition. Parking is deceptively easy to understand. If one lot charges $30 and the lot next door charges 15 tons, customers notice. That means price competition can become intense. But parking isn't perfectly commoditized. Location matters, convenience matters, security matters, covered parking matters, ease of entry matters, payment speed matters, reservations matter. And during major events, availability can matter more than price. If you're late for a baseball game, paying $35 instead of $20 might suddenly seem completely reasonable. That's pricing power. And the best parking locations can have a lot of it. The airport business makes this especially obvious. At some airports, parking is not a side business. It can be a major source of non-airline revenue. For example, an official 2024 financial document for one U.S. port authority reported automobile parking revenue of $35.8 million in 2023, representing approximately 48% of its total operating revenue. FMS bonds offload. Think about that. The airport's core business is moving passengers through an airport, yet parking can represent an enormous part of the financial engine. Why? Because the airport controls something travelers desperately need: a convenient place to leave their car. And travelers are not just paying for square footage. They're paying for convenience. They're paying to avoid driving around looking for a space. They're paying to be close to the terminal. They're paying for security. They're paying for certainty. The same principle applies downtown. The land is valuable because being close to something valuable is valuable. And this brings us to the biggest misunderstanding about parking lots. People think the business is about cars. It isn't. The cars are almost incidental. The real business is scarce access to valuable land. The car is simply the customer occupying the unit. A hotel sells temporary access to a room. A self-storage company sells temporary access to storage space. A parking operator sells temporary access to land. That is why parking can have surprisingly attractive economics. The inventory doesn't get consumed. It gets reused. Over and over. And if demand is strong enough, the same piece of land can generate revenue hundreds or thousands of times. But there is an even deeper lesson. The most successful parking businesses aren't necessarily the ones with the most spaces. They're the ones that control the best combination of location, utilization, pricing, cost structure, and capital. Consider two owners. Owner A has 500 cheap spaces in an unpopular location. Owner B has 100 spaces next to a major downtown destination. Owner A has 5 times the capacity, but owner B may have far better economics, because the value of a parking space is determined by what people are willing to pay to use it, and that depends on what is happening around it. That's why parking is really a real estate arbitrage business. You acquire or control land. You turn that land into parking capacity. You capture demand from nearby economic activity. Then you optimize the price and utilization of every space. If you can increase revenue without dramatically increasing costs, the value of the asset can rise, and that's where the business becomes much more interesting. So, is owning a parking lot actually a good business? The answer is, sometimes, but only under the right conditions. If you own the land in a high-demand location, have manageable debt, strong utilization, reasonable operating costs, and pricing power, a parking asset can generate substantial recurring cash flow. But if you overpay for the land, rely on expensive debt, face weak demand, or lease a property at an aggressive rent, the economics can collapse surprisingly quickly. The biggest mistake would be looking at a parking lot and saying, "It's cheap to operate, so it must be profitable." That's incomplete. The expensive part isn't necessarily the pavement. It's controlling the right piece of land, and that is the entire secret. A parking lot is not really a business about storing cars. It is a business about monetizing scarcity. There is only so much land next to an airport, only so much land next to a stadium, only so much land in the center of a city, only so many spaces within walking distance of a hospital. And when thousands of people want access to that location at the same time, a very ordinary piece of asphalt suddenly becomes a toll booth. The owner doesn't need to manufacture anything. They simply control the gate. And every time another car passes through it, the land earns again. That's why the most important number in a parking lot isn't the number of cars, it's the amount of cash each piece of land can generate. Because when you look beneath the asphalt, the real business isn't parking. It's turning scarce space into recurring cash flow, and that's the part most people never see. If you would actually invest in a parking lot, would you rather own the land, operate the parking business, or simply manage the facility for someone else? Let me know what you think, and subscribe to Money Behind for the next breakdown of the businesses that quietly move enormous amounts of money.